Welcome to the advanced course in Communication Sciences. This training program, developed as part of the M.3A project, Advanced E-Learning for Cultural Heritage Restorers Specialization, has been designed to provide graduates with an in-depth exploration of the vast world of human communication in all its forms, from traditional to digital and intercultural. Targeting students with a previous degree, the program aims to refine the professional skills necessary to thrive in an ever-evolving communication landscape. Through an interdisciplinary approach, we will explore communication theories and practices, analyzing the central role that communication plays in contemporary societies. From advertising to political communication, from journalism to new digital technologies, this course aims to provide a solid theoretical foundation along with practical skills that enable students to seize opportunities and address the challenges of an increasingly connected world. The course also aims to encourage an ethical and responsible perspective in communication, considering the social, cultural, and ethical impact of our communicative interactions. Communication is the foundation of all human relationships, and while we use it daily, we are not always aware of the underlying logic, the processes it triggers, and the incredible potential it holds. Communication serves multiple functions: the emotional or expressive function, related to expressing feelings and thoughts; the informative function, for transmitting data and information; and the contact function, which is used to establish, maintain, or break contact. Think of greetings, exclamations, for example. Communication is a social expression, as it puts value at the service of someone. However, simply speaking or writing is not enough for communication, as it occurs when the expression is understood and becomes common heritage among the participants. This highlights the importance of acquiring and strengthening communication skills, especially in certain work contexts such as the corporate environment, where proper and effective communication immediately translates into benefits for the work environment and clients. This course is designed to provide graduates with an introductory overview of advanced communication theories, offering a critical and in-depth look at the fundamental principles and practical applications in the digital age. Present advanced communication theories examine the evolution of communication in contemporary contexts, analyze theoretical approaches applied to communication in various fields. Module 1, Introduction to Communication Sciences. In this first module, we will delve into the foundations of communication sciences, exploring key theories, models, and dynamics of human communication. The main objective is to provide a solid theoretical foundation for understanding how communication interactions occur, develop, and transform in various contexts. Module 2, Communication as an Integral Lever in Marketing. The second module focuses on the importance of communication in the context of modern marketing. Why? We'll examine effective communication strategies to reach and engage the audience, analyzing the impact of advertising campaigns, branding, and new trends in digital marketing. Module 3, Employee Motivation as a Quality Element in the Organization. In the third module, we will address the crucial role of communication in managing and motivating staff within organizations. We will explore motivation theories, internal communication strategies, and how these influence productivity and the quality of the work environment.
Communicating, which means sharing something with others, involves relating to others in order to transmit news, give orders, and make requests, express feelings and emotions, ask questions, and provide answers, and so on. In other words, it means making our thoughts evident through tools and techniques that others can interpret and understand. All living beings communicate in their own way, including plants, and this activity is especially crucial for humans, who are by nature social animals, as the Greek philosopher Aristotle, 4th century BC, wrote in his Politics, bound inextricably to their peers by complex emotional and functional relationships. Communication is a vital necessity that is part of the fundamental needs that contribute to the preservation of the species. Human beings cannot exist without communicating and communicate even before birth, while in the womb. The newborn, in fact, needs more than just nourishment and warmth, he also needs words, i.e., communication. Therefore, we can establish that there is an intimate connection between life and communication. On this subject, Abraham Maslow argued that humans begin to feel the urge to satisfy primary needs, and only after satisfying them do they tend to satisfy more evolved needs. He developed this concept by creating a hierarchy of needs represented as a pyramid. The need for communication is located at the first level of Maslow's pyramid, among the physiological needs. Maslow demonstrated that humans first have an urgent need to satisfy primary needs, i.e., physiological ones. Only after satisfying them do they feel the need to satisfy others that are more evolved.
At the first level, there are primary needs related to survival, which originate from the physiological needs of the individual, hunger, thirst, sleep, etc. At the second level, there are security needs, which prompt humans to protect themselves from dangers that may threaten the individual. They are associated with owning a home and a job. At the third level, we find social needs, such as belonging to and identifying with a group, in general, civil society, or the need for love, being part of a network of friendships or a family. At the fourth level, there are needs related to self-esteem, such as having a high social status. At the fifth level, there are needs related to self-realization, and the desire to express one's full potential. As Maslow said, a man must be what he can be. Subsequently, the American psychologist added knowledge needs and aesthetic satisfaction needs to the pyramid, placing them at a level preceding self-realization. These refer to amplified needs in society. Self-realization, that is, the ultimate and highest level, is the most desirable goal of modern man, but we have seen that it can only be achieved after all the other needs of the stairs. In fact, compared to other living beings, humans possess much more complex and richer modes of communication, which, for the most part, are not unidirectional, but involve a continuous exchange of roles between the transmitter and the receives the message. Communicating is an act inherent in human beings. He does not decide whether to be a communicator. He is one from the very beginning of his existence. Communication is part of the very essence of the human being, as is his being a thinking or his social being, and it is the tool that connects his needs to his ability to express them. The communication is thus not just a means or a tool, but a constitutive psychological characteristic, dynamic, constantly evolving in humans and among humans. Communication is relational in nature, as it underlies the relationship between human beings, and is the basis of social interaction. In fact, the term communicate itself is historically linked to the Latin adjective communis and the verb Latin communicare, whose initial definition was that of sharing a charge. The term communication is derived from the verb communicate, which in its original meaning means to put in common, meaning to share thoughts, opinions, experiences, sensations and feelings with others. To communicate does not mean simply to talk, but necessarily presupposes a relationship and thus an exchange. The word communication appears in the Italian language in modern times, 16th–18th centuries, with the meaning we still give it today, comes from the Latin word communicatio, which itself descends from a construction based on the verb communicare thanks to the addition of the addio ending to the root of the verb. Specifically, the verb communicare is constructed from the prefix cum, which means with, together, and from the verb munire, which means to tie. In this sense, it is possible to note the basic meaning of the term. Communication literally corresponds to the phrase to share, or to the word that currently we use to share. We can therefore understand the word communication in different meanings. However, there is always inherent size imposed by the prefix cum, and the verb munire, i.e., the size of the sharing. To communicate it therefore means sharing something, but, more specifically, share what? To answer this question it will be appropriate to formulate a general definition. Communication is the transmission of information. This definition is known as Shannon's mathematical theory of communication weaver. Communication should be understood as any type of process, in which two or more systems, people, machines, animals, plants, biological subsystems, organs, etc., even different as regards the genus that them distinguishes, they exchange one or more messages with each other, having specific reference, i.e., arguments, using a certain physical channel, a medium, and a certain symbolic code, a shared system of symbols, of transmission. Communicating is one of the most widespread, and probably among the most complex, activities that individuals carry out, consciously or unconsciously, and represents a continuous and dynamic process. There is a very simple way of saying what communication means. Communication is the displacement, or movement, of a particle from one part of space to another part of space. The particle is what is communicated. It can be an object, a written message, a spoken word, or an idea. Communicating is a vital need. Only through communication, thus the exchange of information, can humans, but also all other animals, can feed and reproduce, as well as obtain a position in the social group. Communication consists of a passage of information from an issuing subject to a recipient. Humans, by nature, are inclined to communicate. Communication occurs not only through the verbal language, but can also take place through nonverbal language. Signage, road signs, for example, is a form of communication. Every type of communication, whether verbal or nonverbal, goes through a track or pattern. So, by communicative process, we mean a voluntary process of transmitting information, implemented with a specific purpose and based on a system of signs and rules shared by the sender and receiver. Code. The message, once transmitted by the sender, is decoded, interpreted, and understood by the receiver. Communication is thus a process during which two subjects interact and implement actions aimed at the production, transmission, interpretation, and understanding of messages, based on a code shared, e.g., a language. Communication is also a voluntary process and thus differs from expression, which is instead an involuntary transmission of information, generally manifested by symbols to which the perceiver ascribes meaning, e.g., the blush on the cheeks may indicate a feeling of shame or shyness. With communication, an exchange of information that is not necessarily of a referential nature and serves to manage and create social relationships, activate actions and behaviors. To communicate, individuals use a series of signals, which they share the meaning of and can be visual, auditory, olfactory, or tactile. The set of these signs, each of which is composed of a signaling element and a notic element, that is, of meaning, constitutes the code. For communication to be effective, interlocutors must share the same code, that is, a set of signs and rules for encoding, selecting, and combining them. For communication to occur, however, cognitive process of interpretation and understanding must be activated in the recipient. Therefore, it is not sufficient to simply pass information, or a simple automatic reaction. There must be an activity of interpretation. Codes are sets of signs and rules for encoding, selecting, and combining them. The characteristics of codes depend on the signs that constitute them. In general, a sign is a symbol that indicates another thing that is not physically present. In practice, it is a bit like if the sign were the substitute for another element, to which it is permanently connected. For example, red, in a traffic light, indicates the prohibition to proceed, while green indicates permission to do so. The element that acts as a substitute is called the signifying element, while the element to which the signaling element refers and is permanently connected is called the meaning. In addition to the signs, the code is constituted by the rules for encoding, selecting, and combining them together. When a sender formulates a message using a code, it encodes it. When the recipient receives and understands it, it decodes it. In the language code, for example, the sounds are fixed that, combined in various ways, make up the words. Each sound must be produced, that is, pronounced, correctly, to be recognized with certainty. Otherwise, whoever is listening does not understand, or, worse, misunderstands what is said. Depending on the type of signals that constitute them, codes have different characteristics. There are indeed gestural codes, such as sign language, chromatic codes, such as traffic lights, iconic codes, such as road signs, and verbal codes, such as human languages. In particular, languages use signs composed of a signifying element, consisting of sounds, phonemes, in oral use, or graphic elements, graphemes, in written use, and a meaning, that is, a concept or mental representation. The meaning is not the real entity, referent, but the mental image of it. The relationship between the signifying element and the meaning is arbitrary. There is no rule by which a signifying element must be associated with a meaning, so much so that different languages make different associations. Codes that do not use sounds are called nonverbal. The term nonverbal indicates everything that is not a word, that is, everything that is not spoken language, which is considered the most refined and evolved means of relating. Communication is a dynamic exchange, a sending and receiving of information, thoughts, attitudes, a sharing and construction of meanings. Nonverbal communication could therefore be defined as a transmission of content, construction, and sharing of meanings that takes place regardless of the use of words. The nonverbal component of communication, in fact, includes all aspects of messages different from words. An analysis of the various models that have over time attempted to describe communication as an interaction and series of behaviors shows how the idea of communication becomes increasingly articulated, coming from a simple linear exchange of information between sender and receiver, a complicated dynamic in which the role of the recipient.
American scholars Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver illustrated their model of communication, called the engineering model, in the late 1940s, in the volume Mathematical Theory of Communication, the Mathematical Theory of Communication. According to the scholars, communication is the passage of information from a sender to a receiver, through an encoding element, a channel, and a decoding element. This model does not account for the complex dynamics of human communication, but it is sufficient to describe the communicative acts carried out in the animal world, which at least appear to be devoid of ambiguity. In human interpersonal communication, it is not a simple process of encoding and decoding, but the fundamental role of interpretation comes into play. Communication is thus reduced to the mere function of packaging a message and transmitting it. It is described as a linear, mechanical, and unidirectional process, in which only the information carried is paid attention to the literal wording, a machine-to-machine communication in which the sender and the receiver appear disembodied. The excessive schematization of the elements also does not take into account the subjective aspects of the sender and the receiver that can characterize communication. The engineering model, therefore, has some limitations. It does not consider, in fact, a whole series of factors, cognitive, emotional, social, cultural, that intervene in a decisive way in the communicative process and that, consequently, cannot be overlooked for its optimal description and understanding. This is because it deals with information from the moment it is encoded until it is decoded, without worrying about the cognitive process that leads to its production and use. It therefore establishes whether the emitted data arrive intact at their destination, without worrying about their function.
In a human communicative exchange, it is not enough for the data transmission to be successful, as there can be various levels of understanding of the same data. For example, one may understand little, adequately, a lot, very much, or everything. Additionally, this model does not account for all aspects related to different channels and means. For instance, written communication operates according to different dynamics compared to oral communication. Roman Jakobson, 1896–1982, a Russian linguist and semiotician, was one of the leading proponents of the structuralist school. He is responsible for developing the main model regarding linguistic communication. Jakobson's model promoted a theory of communication that, by adapting and correcting the limitations of the Shannon and Weaver model, better fit the description of the human communicative process. In Jakobson's model, communication is a process of transmitting a message from a sender to a recipient through a channel, in which actors, linguistic code, context, and circumstances in which the act takes place play a fundamental role. The elements that make up the communicative process, according to Jakobson, are therefore 6. Sender, context, message, transmission channel, code, recipient. Jakobson's model reformulates the engineering model, taking into account the actors involved, as creative subjects, each differently characterized, for example, by knowledge, expectations, desires, needs, and the contextual and circumstantial aspects that constitute the distinctive trait of human communication. Indeed, in communication, at least two elements interfere and can modify the meaning of the message: the context in which the process takes place, and the scale of values of the two subjects of communication, i.e., their view of the world and life. The context is the physical and cultural place where communication takes place. It is the set of all those pieces of information that people who communicate must refer to. The context can be facilitating or less so. A phrase like, "open the window," can mean that it is too hot in the room, or that there is a bad smell. Only those present at the communicative act can understand it. The scale of values of the sender and the recipient influence the outcome of the communication process. Culture, needs, the sphere of values that the sender and recipient may or may not share, constitute a filter through which every message is produced and, subsequently, decoded. The lack of sharing of the value universe can be the origin of misunderstandings. This is very common in intercultural communication, i.e., communication between subjects who come from different cultures. Jacobson also identified the functions that a message can take on, classifying them according to the goals that the sender wants to achieve. The emotional or expressive function focuses on the sender and occurs when the message conveys the emotions, feelings, opinions, and moods of the sender. This function is usually fulfilled by texts such as diaries, love letters, appeals, etc. Example: ouch, what pain. The conative function is directed towards the recipient and occurs when the purpose of the message is to convince them, directly or indirectly. This function is fulfilled by advertising messages, advertisements, but also requests, orders, etc. Example: don't run. Poetic function for the message, when the focus is on style and therefore on the elaboration of the message for aesthetic purposes. This function is mainly used in poetic texts, songs, but also in wordplay, advertising, politics, etc. Example: Amar cha nulo amato amar perdona. The metalinguistic function is achieved when the message is centered on the code itself, the language, and its components, namely the words. When analyzing the meaning and form of a word in a specific language, as in dictionaries and grammars, the metalinguistic function is used. Example: il is a singular, masculine definite article. The phatic function ensures and maintains contact between the sender and the recipient, verifying that the channel used is appropriate for the transmission to be made. The phatic function is used when, more than communicating something, the message serves to confirm the continuity of contact between the interlocutors. For example, during a phone call, the listener can produce short but continuous messages that testify that they are following the conversation. Example: yes, I understand. The referential function draws attention to the context accompanying the communication, which may concern general information of any kind, in which the opinion of the sender or the participation of the recipient is not determinant, warnings, messages contained in signs, etc. Example: caution, fresh paint. Interpersonal communication is the sharing of messages between two or more people in visual and/or auditory contact. To communicate is to share in common, direct, face-to-face or by telephone, or indirect. This exchange of messages, conscious, voluntary or involuntary, is inevitable, and follows a specific process, the effectiveness of which depends on a series of factors that facilitate or hinder mutual understanding. When two human beings come into contact, they automatically, and often unconsciously, begin to exchange information: gender, age, ethnicity, status, mood. The more similarities there are between them, the lower the risk of misunderstanding. Three main factors that make up the basis of interpersonal understanding are identified: the similarity of perceptual orientations, understood as similarity in the way of perceiving reality; the similarity of belief systems, opinions; and the similarity of communication styles, the commonality of topics that are preferred to be addressed, and the mode, direct, indirect, etc., used to address them. To better analyze the various stages of this process, identify what can be obstacles to mutual understanding, and how to neutralize them, it is necessary to delve into communication, at least the intentional one, starting from the moment when the first individual, whom we will call the emissary, decides to send a message to the second, receiver. The first operation the sender must perform is to process the message, transforming an internal thought into a set of elements that can be shared with others. Once the information has been processed, the The sender must decide which code to use to express it, the verbal or nonverbal code, and therefore which transmission channel to use, the auditory channel for the first, the visual channel for the second. This choice involves a series of advantages and disadvantages, and can be more or less appropriate for the content of the message you want to express. Verbal communication relies on a conventional code, language, which necessarily must be shared by the interlocutor if you want them to understand what is being transmitted to them. Nonverbal or analog communication, on the other hand, includes all those codes that do not rely on words, body language, music, drawing, use of color, which represent reality through immediate and universal analogies. It is man's oldest language. Gesture language was initially the only tool of human communication, and only relatively recently did man develop spoken language. It is optimal for transmitting emotions and moods with immediacy, and mainly relies on the visual channel, the fastest to be receptive, and retains almost all the information. Whatever code and transmission channel is chosen, however, the message is destined to undergo criticalities that undermine its effectiveness, dispersion and distortion. The first implies that the message arrives at the recipient incomplete. Environmental and psychological factors inevitably interfere. They cannot be completely eliminated, but can be very contained. A noisy and disturbed environment can cover part of the spoken message, making it difficult to receive, as well as a generally uncomfortable environment reduces the recipient's attention and concentration capabilities. The same applies if the volume and tone of the sender's voice are not appropriate. The loss of attention, and therefore partial reception, can also be due to factors such as lack of interest in the topic addressed or in the speaker, the presumption of already knowing the content of the message, or a non-optimal emotional and physical situation. To neutralize these criticalities and reduce them as much as possible, it is necessary, first of all, for communication to take place in a non-disturbed environment, for all sources of distraction and discomfort to be eliminated or contained to the maximum. It is also important for the sender to attract and maintain the attention of the interlocutor with an appropriate volume and tone of voice, using the auditory and visual channels as much as possible, thus integrating the potential of both, and explicitly highlighting what is central for them, in terms of content. What in written communication is achieved using underlining, special characters, or a different color from the rest of the text. More insidious is distortion. In this case, it is not the reception of the message that is compromised, but its understanding. The recipient, upon receiving the message, must decode it in order to make it their own, that is, transform the words heard or the images seen into elements that are comprehensible to them. Communication can be said to be effective if these elements correspond, even if they do not perfectly match, to those that the sender wanted to express. If this does not happen, it is because the message has arrived heavily distorted. One cause can certainly be the different mastery of the language used by the sender and the recipient. The former may have chosen inappropriate terms, or the latter may not have complete familiarity with that linguistic code. Each message implies that there are two subjects, sender and recipient, which must be placed on the same plane of importance, within the scope of communication. Equality of roles is an aspect of civilization that has been established gradually. The previously traceable communication exchange, in fact, was organized on the two different levels of those who gave orders and those who carried them out. The passing of orders from one subject to another follows a vertical trajectory. In the context of vertical communication, if the two subjects were on different levels and had a different relational importance, with the evolution of social and cultural aspects, communication has also changed, following a horizontal movement that implies equal dignity for the two involved subjects. Subsequently, according to a more current view, communication has taken on a circular form, in which subjects interact with each other through continuous feedback loops, in accordance with the modes in which communicative exchange occurs and the relationship between the interlocutors. Two major categories of communication are distinguished: interpersonal communication and social communication. If the exchange takes place in a circular manner, and the recipient has the opportunity to send feedback to the sender about the message, we speak of interpersonal communication. This can occur between two or more interlocutors, who interact by exchanging messages in a bidirectional and immediate manner. In this type of communication, the roles of sender and recipient are not fixed and established in advance but are continuously exchanged according to, precisely, a circular scheme. Although interpersonal communication typically takes place in the presence of the interlocutors, for example, in a face-to-face dialogue, a work meeting, a conversation between friends or family, etc., this condition is not indispensable, especially today. The possibility of interpersonal communication at a distance is facilitated by means of communication that allow for direct and immediate exchange of feedback, the telephone, email, chat, etc. If, on the other hand, the exchange takes place in a vertical manner by a sender, who expresses a message intended for a large group of recipients, without them having the possibility or necessity to respond, we speak of social communication. Examples of social communication are conferences, films, songs, advertising messages, newspapers, and all those situations in which recipients are limited to receiving a message without being able to reply. The typical condition of social communication is the one realized through mass media, or mass communication means, called so precisely because they allow a message to be transmitted to a very large and undifferentiated audience of interlocutors. However, even in this field, the situation is changing. Indeed, mass communication today is no longer linked to the view of the audience as an undifferentiated and massified entity, but as a set of individuals with different needs and requirements. Thanks to the tools provided by Web 2.0, the audience has the opportunity to reply to social communication, putting into practice personalized forms of interpersonal communication. Communication is a usual and continuous experience of relating to others, which tends to mutually influence people in relation. The sender, by sending their message, not only reveals something about themselves and conveys information, but is motivated by the goal of influencing the attitudes and behaviors of the interlocutor. However, what matters is what the other person perceives, which influences their response. Interpersonal communication, like that of animals, also presents a strategic component. In order to induce the interlocutor to react and behave as desired, the sender must study a strategy, that is, a method that is as effective as possible. Otherwise, the recipient will not react, nor behave as desired. This strategy must induce the recipient, first and foremost, to pay attention to the transmitted message, and maintain it throughout the transmission. To neutralize the risk of dispersion, use an easily and immediately understandable code, to limit distortion, and appear credible and desirable. To motivate the recipient to the desired behavior. At the verbal level, some precautions can be taken in this direction. Facilitate understanding by making communication as linear as possible, avoiding the creation of cognitive dissonance. Telling a person, "Don't come until you finish your task," is less effective than saying, "Come when you finish your task." Keep in mind that words have an evocative power. Avoid evoking images and emotions different from or opposite to those desired. Saying, "I entrust you with a difficult task," immediately evokes difficulty, which is a negative concept, while saying, "I entrust you with a challenging task," focuses attention on the necessary effort, a positive concept. In general, everything that expresses negativity is rejected or removed as quickly as possible in the recipient, as it generates anxiety and stress, while a positive expression is not only understood more quickly, but also remembered for a longer time. Nonverbal communication was the first form of communication among human beings, capable of transmitting emotions and moods in an immediate and universally understandable way, as well as the fundamental relationships between individuals: attack, escape, dominance, surrender, and submission. Some of these behaviors, borrowed from the animal world, have been culturally reinterpreted and are still present, albeit modified and diversified, in various human communities. Others have remained unchanged and common to all human beings, such as smiling, crying, and yawning. In the communication process, the analog code can have the function of emphasizing and reinforcing what is expressed by the verbal code, but only if there is coherence between the two. Otherwise, the first will prevail and connote the meaning of the message and the relationship between the two actors involved. We also remember that, even in the absence of a real verbal exposure, some expressions that fall within the paraverbal field, such as play a fundamental phatic function at the feedback level to express our attention, especially in telephone communication, which cannot rely on the observation of the face to receive such feedback. Within nonverbal communication, facial expressions are one of the aspects that most impress the interlocutor, but of which the sender is generally unaware, as they have no way of observing themselves from the outside. It concerns the muscular movements that determine the expressions of the face, and not its conformation, which is instead studied by physiognomy. Gestures, on the other hand, consist of the movements of the upper limbs, hands and arms, which we use, most of the time consciously and voluntarily, to strengthen or even replace verbal messages. Of all the elements of nonverbal communication, they are the ones we most easily become aware of and control, as they fall within our visual field. In gestures, we can analyze the type, amplitude, and speed that define the meaning of the message sent. Although we must always bear in mind that every gesture must be contextualized within the overall communicative acts, and within the cultural context in which it is expressed. Some gestures, in fact, are innate and common to the entire human species, while many others, learned, have a cultural matrix. Effective communication is not as simple as it may seem. We all communicate constantly, both in our personal lives and at work. Therefore, it is essential to seriously reflect on our own communication style. Assertiveness provides guidance on the various ways people communicate and provides tools for developing assertive communication. Assertiveness is a central element of communication skills. Being assertive means being able to express oneself and stand up for one's point of view, while respecting the ideas and rights of others. Assertive communication is based on mutual respect and is an effective and diplomatic communication style. A fundamental prerequisite for assertive behavior is the ability to perfectly understand the emotional state of others, so as not to create conflict, and to show respect for the people with whom one interacts. Assertive communication can be defined as the ability to express oneself without imposing oneself, and at the same time without letting the other prevail. It is the art of cultivating a balanced and peaceful discourse. In order to clearly and effectively express one's emotions and ideas without fearing the judgment of others. It is a process through which we learn to assert ourselves and value our opinions. Assertiveness requires mutual respect and listening, abandoning aggressive or, conversely, passive attitudes. The main elements of assertive communication are: assertiveness communicates trust in one's ability to think and make decisions, clear and precise goals, attitude towards listening, knowing how to say no without feeling guilty, constructively criticizing behavior, not the person. An assertive person cannot help but develop a particular form of listening towards others, called empathic or active listening. It is a type of listening enriched by all those emotional fragments that inevitably strike an assertive and empathic subject when relating. Perceiving these nuances allows one to put the interlocutor at ease and creates a flow of emotionally charged communication that generates harmony and understanding between the parties. Empathic communication is not only one of the main components of helping and cooperative relationships, but it is also a valuable tool in any work environment and in the social sphere. The term empathy comes from Greek and refers to the ability to see the world through the eyes of another person. An empathic person is able to understand the inner world of another, affects, thoughts, emotions, etc., without making them their own. Empathic communication is an attitude that one possesses, when lucky, or can acquire through training. What is learned is the way to open up to others, avoiding the mistakes that close communication. The key elements of empathic communication are understanding and active listening. When communicating with another person, there are two main ways to try to understand what they are telling us. The first form is intellectual understanding, typical of those who want to understand the facts. The listener is therefore focused on the facts that have occurred and how they have unfolded. The focus is on what the other person is telling. The second is empathic understanding, which instead is centered on how our interlocutor is telling the story. The focus is therefore on the emotional nuances that color the narrative and provide information on the narrator's emotional state. Often, one feels understood only when the person listening understands what they are experiencing and not how the event unfolded. Empathic communication that leads to this type of understanding is based on three main elements. 1. Transparency, avoiding masking one's emotional reactions. One can disagree with someone and say so, but lying blocks communication. 2. Self-control, not confusing one's reactions with those of the other, nor allowing one's own needs to prevail. Not everyone is always looking for advice. 3. Unconditional acceptance, avoiding judging the other person's behavior, and focusing on what they are feeling. In order to make the other person open up and give us the opportunity to understand them, it is necessary to demonstrate the ability to listen. Usually the interesting part of a story always comes at the end of the conversation. Listening does not mean standing still and not interrupting. It is a proactive behavior through which to show that we are able to understand the other person. Active listening is typical of those who avoid communication blocks to promote empathy. Let's see what the characteristics of these blocks are. Inquisitive attitude, more focused on the details of what has happened, imposing solutions based on one's own experience. Those who offer easy solutions to others' problems often get offended if they are not listened to. General consoling phrases that do not take into account the specificity of the situation. Expression of personal judgments about what has happened. If the goal is to understand the other person, first of all, we must start from the premise that it is not certain that everything can be understood immediately. It is useful to ask for clarification. For example, paraphrasing what has been told. This allows the speaker to verify our understanding. Two more active strategies are comparison and the use of humor. It is essential to be very careful in both cases. Humor can have the opposite effect if not used with moderation. When actively listening, it is fundamental to be able to read the signals sent by the speaker and control those emitted by us. For this reason, we must always remember that we do not only listen to the contents expressed through words, but we can also listen through nonverbal communication and observing how these contents are transmitted. However, for active listening to be truly effective, it must be empathetic. The technique of empathic mirroring allows us to communicate to the other person our presence in the relationship, giving them the feeling of being heard and understood, thus establishing a climate of trust. This can only happen through attention to content and understanding of emotional states, avoiding interpretations. The use of contact signals is another technique to promote active listening. Benevolent glances, smiles, nods of agreement with the head or face. All this highlights an encouraging and reassuring presence. The conflict can be defined as a divergence in which each of the actors involved in communication wants to impose their own point of view, without making concessions to the other. It is a discordance between what a person wants and what hinders or prevents the satisfaction of that desire itself. Conflicts are inevitable in any context of daily life, so it is necessary to be able to recognize them, manage them, and resolve them in a positive way. It is important to see them as expressions of different views and moments of individual growth, or even as a possibility to improve one's relationships through more effective communication. Conflicts are the daily life of all forms of social living. Even in organizations, microcosms of society, conflicts are physiological, and this is inevitable since organizations are made up of a number, more or less consistent, of people. Conflict is a natural situation within work groups. Moreover, the sudden changes that companies are experiencing at this time can determine an increase in conflictuality with negative repercussions on interpersonal relationships and on the good performance of people. Organizations create particular types of relationships and, therefore, particular types of conflicts, which must be considered as one of the most important components for achieving organizational goals. It is therefore important to understand their origins, functions, and implications on the operational level. However, even if the concept of conflict is easy to grasp intuitively, it becomes more difficult to define it on a theoretical level, and to explain it when it presents itself in work contexts. Conflicts are inevitable, so it becomes essential to recognize them, manage them, resolve them. It is important to see them as expressions of different views and moments of individual growth, and as a possibility to improve one's relationships using effective communication. In various ways, here is a model, Galasa Model, 2004, that summarizes possible reactions to conflict. 1. Abandonment. This attitude expresses fear, weakness, and low self-esteem. It is used when one wants to postpone a problem. Advantages. It is a way to quickly calm the waters. Disadvantages. Losing the opportunity to solve the problem. 2. Accommodation. One tries to find a solution that works for everyone, containing and controlling emotions to preserve human relationships. Advantages. It is a quick method that expresses openness to listening to others' proposals, hoping for subsequent negotiation. Disadvantages. It does not express one's own ideas, and does not help the problem-solving process. 3. Compromise. Both parties, although both coming out as winners, fall short in human relations. Advantages. Both parties play an active role during the conversation, and are quite satisfied with the final outcome. Disadvantages. It may harbor resentment and the desire to dominate, complicating the cooperation process. 4. Confrontation and collaboration. The parties express their points of view and commit to finding a fair solution. They do not want to win, but to overcome the conflict. Advantages. It brings the maximum satisfaction for both parties, expresses listening and respect, both for the other and for oneself, allows for an active role in negotiation. Disadvantages. It requires a lot of time and the availability and trust of both parties, which is not always easy to assume. It requires good self-knowledge and knowledge of the other, as well as good communication skills. 5. Force. Those who act according to this modality want to assert themselves over the other, laying the foundations for a real competition. Advantages. It is implemented when there is little time available, there is certainty of being right, an immediate result is desired, and one is not afraid that interpersonal relationships will be compromised. Those who impose themselves have strong self-esteem. Disadvantages. Those who frequently impose themselves risk isolation. Imposition does not enrich internally because it does not involve a listening phase. There is also a risk of raising criticism from one's interlocutors. Problem solving is a cognitive process that allows for the analysis of a specific situation and the formulation of hypotheses on the best course of action when facing a problem. It is an activity that humans have always practiced for their own survival, from the invention of the wheel to the control of fire and the first systems for cultivating the land. Over time, specific techniques have been developed to solve a wide range of problems, from scientific and economic ones to emotional and relational ones. Here are all the steps that identify a problem-solving process and can lead to effective conflict management. Identify the problem. Problem finding. Before reaching a solution, time and energy must be invested in understanding the problem as best as possible. We can define a problem as a gap between the current state and the desired state. That is, a leap between where you are now and where you would like to be. To define a problem, it is necessary to compare your current situation with the hypothetical situation of the future. Gap analysis. Consider possible solutions. It is now necessary to focus on producing ideas aimed at transforming the problematic situation into an optimal, or at least acceptable situation for all parties involved. In this phase, it is useful to use the brainstorming technique. Evaluate and choose. All the options developed must be evaluated, eliminating one by one those that are considered less advantageous. It is possible to make this choice based on objective values such as effectiveness, the time required for implementation, and costs. Project management. Create a road map. It is necessary to establish the real steps to be taken. In this phase, it may be useful to use the who does what, who, what, where, how much, and why tool to have a well-structured action plan. Act. There are no other stages now. It is time to put the plan into practice. It is time to act. It is necessary to have confidence in the planned action plan to overcome critical moments and have the courage to implement actions and behaviors that may involve risks. Verify. Monitoring the evolution of the defined plan is a very important phase that should not be overlooked. It is always necessary to have good sense and the necessary flexibility to understand that the roadmap needs to be modified due to unforeseen events. Conflict management can be addressed in various ways, as we have seen. A systemic approach to conflict, considering it as a growth moment, combined with a correct problem-solving process, participation, negotiation, and shared responsibility, can increase the level of understanding. Improve processes aimed at effective communication, acting on the feeling of trust between interlocutors, and strengthening relationships. Business communication is a strategic and indispensable tool for the life of any company. Within the business environment, communication represents, today, the ability to dialogue with the external environment in order to understand its needs and anticipate possible changes, as well as with the internal environment to enhance its quality and efficiency. The company is an open system, which inevitably implies that the conduct of its activities is conditioned by establishing relationships with external subjects, whether they are suppliers or customers. From this it follows that for a company, communication is fundamental, and in order for the process to be effective, it is necessary to position itself not only as the sender of messages but also as the recipient in order to better understand the context in which it is inserted, and respond promptly to any changes. Business communication can be verbal or non-verbal, written or gestural. The sending subject, which can be a person, office, company, i.e., a physical or legal entity, has a message in mind, which is transferred according to a common language, which acts as a code. The receiving subject decodes the same message and may communicate a response message, reaction, if necessary. Along the way, the message may encounter noise, i.e., disturbing elements of reception, an incorrect definition of language, noise from the environment, environmental, or temporal conditions. These elements cause the message to be perceived in a distorted way, and the reaction to occur in the wrong way. The receiving subjects are very varied. The main buyers are those around them, the subjects upstream or downstream of the company's activity, those who have interest in it, stakeholders. The awareness of the importance of the role played by communication is, therefore, strategic for the company because it inevitably affects its values, the attitudes of its staff, the beliefs of those who live within it, and determines its results. Communication also influences motivation, and inevitably ends up changing the behavior of its recipients. These aspects, therefore, need to be managed. For this reason, it is necessary to ask ourselves what tools it uses and through which means it can be put into practice. To offer an answer to these issues, it is essential to consider that all the messages that organizations emit are very varied, and, therefore, different in purpose and content. From the style with which management relates to its clients, to informal communications, to those aimed at promoting the product, or transmitting a specific image of the company to the market. For some time now, in business communication, two macro families have been distinguished, which are also very broad, dividing this activity into that directed at external customers and that, conversely, directed at the internal customers of the company, while specifying that the mutual boundaries are increasingly blurring. The two forms of communication are referred to respectively as external communication, internal communication. In the context of corporate communication, external communication refers to the complex of activities and communication flows that originate from the organization and are directed towards external publics, such as clients, suppliers, stakeholders, public opinion, institutions, etc. In the second half of the 1970s, the explosion of the competitive market forced companies to increasingly characterize and differentiate their products in a specific manner, so that they would be immediately recognizable, identifiable, and distinguishable in order to offer them directly to their customers. Concepts such as brand, branding, and image became increasingly important, as they are created through communication and usually require, although in the contemporary context, this element is sometimes greatly attenuated, medium to long-term timeframes, significant investments, and strategies defined in detail. With the advent of private television broadcasting, also known as commercial TV, advertisers who previously could not make their voices heard through television were able to do so thanks to the expanded spaces made available by this crucial development. It is not incorrect to claim that the primary objective of external communication is to create an active relationship between the organization and society. It is incorrect to think of corporate external communication as merely a marketing strategy or plan aimed at achieving objectives such as increased sales. External communication is directed at the target audience, but also at administrations, public institutions, companies, or associations, and contributes to building the perception of the quality of the service. It also constitutes a permanent channel for listening to and verifying the level of customer, user satisfaction, allowing the organization to adapt the service offered accordingly. The tools of an enterprise's external communication can be summarized, in good approximation, as follows. Public relations, defined as the set of activities through which the company, organization considers the attitudes and judgments of public opinion, with the aim of identifying consistent choices of strategy and operations for its various organizational functions, in order to make them consistent with the external environment and the objectives and programs of the company. Institutional advertising, which promotes the image of the company as a whole. Advertising, carried out through the purchase of media space. Sponsorships, which link the organization's image to a specific cultural and/or sporting initiative. Promotions, which enhance the good or service offered with the addition of other elements. Direct marketing, an activity that moves from a mass logic to a selection of a more restricted public, in order to avoid generalist and dispersive communications, with the aim of directing the action towards a greater personalization of the message, and towards the creation of a profitable and continuous relationship. Inserts, interviews, telephone contacts, etc. Product and service catalogs. Sales interviews. Fairs and exhibitions. For internal communication, we mean the set of corporate communication activities aimed at creating an internal network of information flows, and focused on spreading information, knowledge, and expertise, and making the goals of a complex organization clear and shared among its employees. To define the concept of internal communication, we could say that internal corporate communication is the communication activity whose purpose is to inform the internal resources of an organization about everything the company is or does. Now, let's look at the goals of internal communication, which could be different. Let's try to identify some. Facilitate the establishment of a positive relationship between those who are part of the organization. Create a climate of trust within the company. Involve employees, promoting their commitment and dedication. Encourage the sharing of information. When internal communication works, it is more likely that employees will show a spirit of cooperation and collaboration and be genuinely willing to share the company's values and philosophy. Often, an important and delicate element is overlooked. Employees are the ones who project the company's image to the outside world. The final reputation of the company also depends on what those who work there every day think of it. Each organization, before the processes, functions, and departments, is made up of people, human resources that put their skills and know-how at the service of the company. Human resources, which in the past were given little importance, today represent a strategic asset. In this context, the objectives of internal corporate communication aimed at spreading a cultural attitude that permeates all levels of the organization come into play, thus eliminating any distance between human resources and the company. Informing becomes necessary for people to recognize themselves in the company and share its values and strategies, as well as procedures and methodologies for the proper execution of production activities. Not only that, communication is necessary for change. Active participation and sharing allows resistance to change to be overcome, whether it is driven by internal needs or environmental contingencies. The tools of internal communication can be many, and some of these can be used for both internal and external communication purposes. For example, let's think of the company's website. It is an internal communication tool, but is almost always used primarily for external communication activities. To make a website accessible to employees as well, it is possible to integrate the intranet area within it. This is one of the best internal communication tools, thanks to which documents can be shared with other colleagues and there is easy and fast access to important information for one's work. Continuing to look at the web environment, newsletters can also be used for the improvement of internal communication, especially for highly structured realities with a very high number of non-local collaborators. Newsletters can help maintain constant contact with the company.